Here is what is confirmed. 60 seconds ago, in a development that federal investigators have not yet addressed publicly, forensic technicians processing the vehicle belonging to Tommaso Cioni recovered a single item. One object. Found inside a car that had been sitting inside the documented perimeter of this investigation for longer than any public timeline had suggested. That item has not been named in any official statement. It has not been described in any press conference. It has not been acknowledged by any Tier 1 source in language that places it formally into the evidentiary record. But it answered everything. That phrase requires precision. Not everything in the colloquial sense. Not everything in the emotional sense that true crime coverage reaches for when it wants engagement rather than accuracy. Everything in the operational sense. The item found in Tommaso Cioni's vehicle answered the questions that this investigation had been circling for weeks without resolution. The questions about timeline, the questions about coordination, the questions about whether what happened was planned or reactive, singular or collective, the work of one mind or several, one item, one car, one answer that the FBI did not expect to find in the location where they found it. The FBI does not redirect active forensic resources toward a secondary vehicle without a specific evidentiary reason. The reason existed before the item was found. The item is what the reason produced. And what it produced has not left the sealed federal case file. What has left that file in the form of source-level confirmation available to investigators and journalists with direct access to the investigative perimeter is the knowledge that the item exists, that it was found, and that when it was found, the investigation changed direction. That is not peripheral. That is the center of what this script documents. Here is what we knew before today. The name Tommaso Cioni had been present in the investigative background of this case for a documented period. Not named publicly as a suspect, not named publicly as a person of interest in the formal legal classification that carries procedural weight. Present in the way that names become present in active federal investigations, through proximity, through connection, through the kind of associative evidence that investigators gather before they gather the evidence that matters. Proximity is documented. Connection is documented. What was not documented until 60 seconds ago in the timeline this script is built around was the item in the car. That detail matters, because the difference between a name that appears in an investigation's background and a name that appears at its center is often a single piece of physical evidence. A single item recovered from a single location that transforms the associative into the definitive. That is what forensic processing exists to produce. And in the case of Tommaso Cioni, that is what the vehicle produced. The car was not hidden. That is the first operational detail that investigators found significant. A vehicle belonging to an individual whose name had appeared in the investigative background of an active federal case was parked in a location accessible to law enforcement, not concealed, not destroyed, not moved to a location outside the investigative perimeter in the manner consistent with someone who knew that the vehicle contained evidence and acted on that knowledge. The car was there, and what was inside it was there too. That is not theory. That is the physical reality that forensic technicians encountered when they processed the vehicle. And the item they found was not in a hidden compartment. It was not beneath a panel. It was not concealed in a manner requiring specialized recovery techniques. It was in the car in the way that objects are in cars when the person who placed them there did not believe anyone would be looking. That sequence matters. An item hidden with care tells investigators one thing about the person who hid it. An item present without concealment tells them something different. It tells them that the person who left it there either did not know it mattered, did not believe anyone would find it, or did not have the opportunity to remove it before the vehicle was processed. Which of those three possibilities the FBI currently believes has not been officially confirmed. Here is what a single item can do to an investigation that has been moving laterally for weeks. Active federal investigations into abduction and missing persons cases build timelines. They build them from the exterior inward, from the visible evidence toward the structural evidence. from what cameras captured toward what the ground holds, from what neighbors saw toward what forensic processing reveals beneath the surface of the documented record. This investigation had been building that timeline. The Nest camera visits, the street-level sighting on approximately January 11th, the documented surveillance window that stretched across weeks before the abduction, the tunnel beneath the residence. Each layer of evidence expanded the timeline backward and inward. Each layer told investigators that what happened was more prepared, more coordinated, and more deeply embedded in a prior planning period than the surface evidence initially suggested. The item in Tommaso Cioni's car is not a layer. It is a connector. It is the piece of physical evidence that does not expand the timeline in one direction. It runs a line through the entire timeline and connects points that previously existed as separate data: the street-level surveillance, the front door visits, the tunnel, the abduction itself. Those points were documented. They were confirmed. What they lacked was a physical object that placed a specific individual in relationship to more than one of them. The item in the car is that object. That is not a conclusion. The FBI has not stated publicly that the item connects Tommaso Cioni to the documented surveillance timeline, to the tunnel, or to the abduction of February 1st. What sources familiar with the investigation have confirmed is that the item's discovery prompted an immediate escalation of investigative activity directed at Tommaso Cioni specifically. That escalation is the confirmation. The FBI does not escalate against a specific individual in an active federal missing persons case without evidence that justifies the escalation. The item justified it. Here is what the item is not. It is not a weapon. Nothing in the source-level confirmation available at this stage describes the item as a weapon, as contraband, or as a substance. It is not something that would be expected in a vehicle under ordinary circumstances by virtue of its category alone. It is something specific, something whose significance is not intrinsic to the object itself, but derives entirely from the relationship between the object and the documented evidence already in the FBI's possession. That distinction matters enormously. An item whose significance is self-contained, a weapon, a controlled substance, an item bearing blood evidence, tells investigators something about the person who possessed it. An item whose significance derives from its relationship to existing evidence tells investigators something about the investigation. It tells them where the gaps were. It tells them which connections were real and which were circumstantial. It tells them whether the framework they had been building was accurate or whether it required structural revision. The item in Tommaso Cioni's car told them the framework was accurate. Gone is the uncertainty about whether the name in the background belonged at the center. Gone is the investigative ambiguity about what the documented surveillance activity, the tunnel, and the events of February 1st had in common beyond proximity and timeline. The item is the common thread made physical, made recoverable, made forensically processable in a way that moves this investigation from the territory of documented pattern into the territory of documented connection. Here is what the investigation looked like before the car was processed. Federal investigators were operating with confirmed but unconnected evidence. The Nest camera had documented 2 visits to Nancy Guthrie's front door by an individual who had not been publicly identified. The FBI had collected neighborhood security footage specifically targeting January 11th, confirming that the investigative team believed something happened on that morning that was worth pursuing forensically. Aldine Meister had given a named, credentialed eyewitness account placing a suspicious individual outside the property on a date she could anchor to her birthday 3 days prior. The tunnel had been found. The reaction of federal agents to its discovery had been documented through sources as visibly significant, outside the range of professional neutrality that experienced investigators maintain in ordinary evidentiary processing. The tunnel's existence had shifted the investigation's understanding of how the property had been accessed, for how long and by whom. And Tommaso Cioni's name was in the background, connected by proximity, connected by association, connected by the kind of relational evidence that builds a picture without yet proving what the picture shows. That was the state of the investigation before the vehicle was processed. A documented pattern across multiple evidence types and multiple dates. a name associated with the pattern, and a gap between the pattern and the proof. The item in the car closed that gap. Here is what closing a gap means in a federal investigation. It does not mean the case is concluded. It does not mean an arrest is imminent in the hours following the discovery. It does not mean that the sealed federal case file now contains everything the prosecution of this crime will require. Closing an evidentiary gap means that the investigative team has physical confirmation that a connection they suspected was real is real, that the framework they built from exterior evidence inward has now been confirmed by interior evidence outward, that the pattern they documented across weeks of surveillance footage, witness accounts, and structural forensics has a physical object at its center that ties the documented elements together. That is operationally significant in a way that no press conference has yet communicated. Because the press conference has not happened, the official statement has not been issued. The FBI has not stood before cameras and described what was found in Tommaso Cioni's vehicle or what it means for the investigation's direction. What has happened is the finding itself. What has happened is the escalation of investigative activity that the finding produced. And what has happened is the confirmation available at the source level that the item exists, that it was found where it was found, and that when it was found, the people who found it understood immediately what it meant. The FBI does not understand immediately what evidence means unless the evidence is speaking directly to questions they have already been asking. The item in that car answered questions the FBI had been asking for weeks. It answered them in one finding, in one object recovered from one vehicle. That is what changed 60 seconds ago in the documented timeline of this investigation. Here is what Tommaso Cioni's documented position in this case had established before today. Every investigation has a perimeter. The perimeter is defined by the evidence, by who and what the evidence places inside the circle of documented relevance. The perimeter of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, as it was understood before the vehicle was processed, included the documented surveillance activity, the tunnel, and the associative network of individuals whose names had surfaced through financial, relational, and locational data that federal investigators collect in the early stages of a missing persons case. Tommaso Cioni was inside that perimeter. The degree to which he was inside it, the distance between his position in the investigative background and the center of the documented criminal activity, was the operative question. Proximity without physical evidence connecting an individual to a specific criminal act is not sufficient for the investigative escalation that federal standards require. It is sufficient for continued investigation. It is sufficient for the kind of background accumulation that eventually produces the evidence that matters. The vehicle produced that evidence, and what was inside the vehicle moved Tommaso Cioni from the background to the center in the time it took a forensic technician to identify what they were looking at and communicate its significance upward through the investigative chain. That sequence has a specific duration. Source-level confirmation places that duration as immediate. The technician identified the item. The item's significance was apparent in the context of the existing investigative record. The communication moved upward. The escalation began. That is not the sequence of a routine recovery. That is the sequence of a discovery that was recognized on contact. Verification needed on whether Tommaso Cioni has been formally notified that his vehicle has been processed by federal investigators and that its contents are now part of the evidentiary record. Verification needed on whether legal counsel representing Tommaso Cioni has been in contact with federal prosecutors in the period following the vehicle's forensic processing. Here is what the item's location inside the vehicle tells investigators beyond its content. Evidence is not only what it is, evidence is also where it was. The location of an item within a searched space tells investigators how the item was regarded by the person who left it there. A deliberately concealed item tells investigators that the person who concealed it understood its significance and acted on that understanding. An item in plain placement tells investigators something different. It tells them that the person who left it either did not know it was significant, believed it would never be found in that location, or was not given the opportunity to move it. The item in Tommaso Cioni's car was not concealed. It was present, in the car, in a location within the car that forensic technicians reached in the course of a standard vehicle processing procedure. That means one of three things. Either Tommaso Cioni did not know the item was significant enough to remove, or he believed the vehicle would not be processed by investigators, or he did not have the time or opportunity to remove it before the vehicle entered the investigative perimeter. Each of those possibilities carries a different implication for what the FBI now knows about Tommaso Cioni's state of knowledge, his level of preparation, and the degree to which his involvement in the documented criminal activity of this case was calculated or exposed. The FBI has not publicly stated which of those three possibilities they currently believe. What they have done is escalate, and the direction of that escalation toward Tommaso Cioni specifically in the hours following the vehicle's processing is the confirmation that the item's location combined with its content produced an evidentiary picture that the investigation had been building toward without knowing exactly where to find it. It was in the car. It was always in the car. The investigation found it when it found it because federal investigations find what they are looking for when they have built enough of the surrounding picture to know what they are looking at. Here is what this discovery means for the people at the center of Nancy Guthrie's life. An investigation that finds a physical connector between a named individual and a documented criminal timeline is an investigation that has moved from building to closing. Not closed. Building to closing. The distinction is procedural and it is real. Building means accumulating evidence across multiple vectors without yet having the physical object that confirms the pattern. Closing means having that object and beginning the work of constructing the prosecutorial architecture around it. That work has begun. The item in the car is the foundation. What gets built on top of it? The additional forensic processing, the interview escalation, the subpoena activity, the surveillance expansion, the legal architecture that transforms a physical item into a prosecutorial instrument, all of that is now underway. For the people who knew Nancy Guthrie, for the people who have been watching this investigation from the outside, accumulating confirmed facts and waiting for the confirmed fact that changes the direction of the documented record. This is that fact. Not a conclusion, not an arrest, not a named suspect standing before a camera in federal custody, but the physical evidence that moves the investigation from the territory of documented pattern into the territory of documented proof. The FBI has been in the territory of documented pattern for weeks. The tunnel moved them toward the boundary. The item in Tommaso Cioni's car crossed it. Here is what the next 72 hours look like inside this investigation based on what the item's discovery requires procedurally. Federal investigations that recover a physical connector between a named individual and an active criminal timeline do not pause. They accelerate. The acceleration is structured. It follows a sequence that is determined by what the item is, what it connects, and what the legal threshold requirements are for the next procedural step. If the item is sufficient on its own to meet the probable cause threshold required for an arrest warrant, the 72 hours following its discovery will be spent constructing the warrant application. That application will be reviewed, signed by a federal judge, and executed. The execution will not be publicly announced in advance. It will happen when the legal architecture is complete and the operational logistics allow it to happen without compromising the broader investigation. If the item is not sufficient on its own, but is sufficient to justify a grand jury subpoena or a formal interview under caution, the 72 hours will be spent initiating that process. Tommaso Cioni will be contacted. Legal representation will be engaged. A formal investigative interaction will occur that is different in kind and in legal implication from any background investigation that preceded the vehicle's processing. If the item is the connector, but the prosecution requires additional physical evidence to build the case that federal standards demand, the 72 hours will be spent identifying what additional evidence is required and where it is most likely to be found, given what the item has already confirmed. In any of those three procedural pathways, the investigation is not the same investigation it was before the vehicle was processed. The item changed it. The direction is now different. The target is now different. And the timeline to the next publicly visible development in this case is now shorter than it was 60 seconds ago. Verification needed on whether a federal arrest warrant application has been initiated in connection with the item recovered from Tommaso Cioni's vehicle. Verification needed on whether Tommaso Cioni's current location is known to and being monitored by federal investigators following the vehicle's processing. Here is what a single item in a single car means in the larger architecture of what happened to Nancy Guthrie. The Nest camera captured 2 visits to a front door. The visits were documented. The visitor was not publicly identified. The backpack in the second visit was noted as an anomaly. The walkie-talkie was noted as evidence of coordination. The January 11th street-level surveillance was confirmed by a named witness who anchored the date to her birthday. The tunnel beneath the residence was discovered during forensic processing of a primary crime scene and produced a reaction in federal agents that sources described as visibly outside the professional neutrality baseline.